You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Wil Medearis. Welcome to Author Stories. Find archives of all the shows at hankgarner.com, and while you're there, never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and YouTube. It's free on all platforms. As we get into today's show, I'd like to tell you guys about some incredible new releases that I know you're going to love. The brand new book from Nathan Heistad, Rift, The Resistance, Book 1. They've watched us for centuries through the rift. They prepared. Invasion is inevitable. The Earth fleet has known of the Watchers for years, unwilling to share the knowledge with humanity. Now it might be too late. Hidden away from the fleet, one man is creating a new colony ship destined for the other side of the rift, but he's missing a few pieces. 3 other people have varied paths to get there. Ace goes from the streets of Earth to the fleet training facility on the moon. Flint, an ex-fleet pilot, must decide if a job is worth his life. And Wren, imprisoned for a secret project years ago, is given hope as an unlikely ally, whispers words of escape in her ear. Their journeys lead to Councilman Jordan Fairbanks, who knows of the impending invasion and has prepared. All they can do is wait for the rift to open once again and see what's on the other side. Rift joins an ensemble cast facing immeasurable obstacles. If you enjoy space battles, prison breaks, androids, and aliens, buried under a shroud of mystery, this book is for you. Try it today. A fresh new fiction adventure from the author of the best-selling Survivor series. Rift, The Resistance, Book 1. Now available. There's a link in the show notes. Till Death and the entire Rockwell Returns Files series is now available from Audible.com. A laugh-out-loud communist-punching adventure. Sam Rockwell came home from the Second World War to work as a fledgling private investigator specializing in helping returns. Recently deceased ghosts who've come back with unfinished business. Check out this audiobook clip from Book 1 of the Rockwell Return Files series from author Jason Anspach.
Unbelievable. Alice entered the dining room and saw her husband standing with his coat draped over his arm, his hat still resting on his head. "Take your hat off, Frank. Now, about the pot roast." Frank pulled his hat tightly to his head, slightly twisting it in defiance. He saw on the table an alien supper, seeking his approval from white china. With hands rooted to his hips, he lifted a desolate face to Alice. "No pot roast," he whimpered. "I'm sorry, it's just that Colette Peterson—" "No pot roast even!" he exploded. "A man like me never catches a break. I tell you, the nerve of some people." "You're being unreasonable, dear. We can have pot roast tomorrow night." "Not you. Them or him. However many it was. And on bowling and pot roast night." Frank circled a finger in the air for emphasis. "That's what really steams me." "You're not making any sense. What happened, dear?" Alice asked, crossing the room toward her gesticulating husband. "What happened?" Frank echoed, his face red from the effort. "The worst day of my life, that's what happened." "Oh, darling." Alice closed the gap between herself and her husband and felt a matrimonial pull to rest her hand and head on Frank's chest, something that always seemed to soothe him. Her eyes widened in surprise as her hand passed through his body, like a wind through fog. "Frank!" Alice yelped with a backward jerk, hastily removing her hand from the chill miasma. "Did you die today?" "It is," Frank said, removing his hat to bring it slowly to his bosom, "as you say." In reverence for his now past life, he screwed his head slightly up and to his right, staring into the heavens. Alice took another step back as Frank held his pose. It was an exact imitation of a statue he once saw of Admiral Porter. Frank felt resplendent with somber and regal airs. He waited for the sobbing to begin. "You look ridiculous," Alice said dismissively.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. You guys, today I'm really excited to have Wil Medearis on the phone with me today. Wil has a fantastic new book. It's called Restoration Heights, and I think you guys are really going to love it. It's a really unique story that I have not seen much of lately. So, and Wil has a fascinating story that we're going to get into in a few minutes. Welcome to the show, Wil.
Oh, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here. But Wil, before we get into all the good stuff we're going to talk about, Wil, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
So taking the most expansive possible definition of storyteller.
Yeah.
I used to, I grew up in the era of like action figures, the little Star Wars toys and the G.I. Joe toys and stuff.
Not dolls.
Yeah.
Action figures, right? Yeah.
So I just, I don't know how other kids would play with them, but I would usually have these like just epic, grand narratives, crossover series. And, at this point I'm in like second grade or something, third grade. And I wasn't so much interested in like having G.I. Joe and Cobra battle, although that happened, as I was in like having these like, massive stories kind of play out. And I just remember, other kids like kind of laughing at me, like to just like simplify it. I just being like, no, I want to have these narratives happen. I didn't use the word narratives, obviously, but that's probably looking back, that's probably was a sign that I was interested in stories and how they played out,
Right. Were you a big reader as a kid?
Oh God, yeah. I read. I don't ever remember not reading.
What were some of the early stories that really grabbed your attention and ramped up your imagination?
Early stories, and I don't really know when was when because it's all kind of sort of muddled together. But I remember really liking, I think everyone kind of did, Encyclopedia Brown.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, you know what? No, before that, some of the first books I remember are like, do you know that book, Bunnicula and Howlett A.M.? This is totally a thing probably from my childhood, but there was a story, Bunnicula, and there was a whole series of them, and they were kind of horror movie spoofs, but they featured animals.
Yes.
Spoke to each other. Yeah. I remember like staying up all night reading those, like kind of over and over again.
Nice. Was there, you had this epic storytelling thing in your mind with your action figures, and so and I think that's the experience of a lot of kids, probably in our generation. Mm-hmm. Did that ever spill out onto paper, or at what point did you kind of start seeing the storytelling thing kind of congeal into something more formal? I don't remember when I sort of wrote a first like story, or if there's anything like that with with school related projects before this. I'm sure there probably were instances where I needed to write a story, but I remember trying to write my first novel in the 7th grade with like a number 2 pencil and a notebook, and I didn't make it very far. I think I did make it. I remember finding it at some point. This was years and years ago, but I think I had like 60 or 70 handwritten pages that I'd gotten that far, but nothing was really happening in it. But yeah, that's really the earliest time I can remember. What kinds of things were you writing or wanting to write?
At that time, I was just kind of had the usual sort of, I guess, adolescent boy, obsessions, right? I liked comic books. I liked Dungeons and Dragons, so that was kind of mostly what I was writing to, or like either sort of a comic book story or like elves and dragons or something along those lines. Rarely do most of us,
know exactly what we want to do when we go to college. I want to be an artist. I want to be a writer. And rare is the person who studies those things in college and then comes out and just immediately starts doing the thing that they've always dreamed of doing. What did you study, and how did you see your life going, when you're kind of in those formative years of leaving home and kind of striking out on your own?
I had a sort of a long kind of winding path through college. I started out, I knew that I liked to draw. I knew that I liked to read. I knew that I liked to write. At the time, I was also enjoyed like acting and just kind of in general arts.
Yeah.
In general, movies, whatever. And, but I didn't really know what that would translate to in terms of like a career or a major or anything like that. And I think I bounced around across majors and then eventually dropped out after my freshman year of college, and moved around with some friends, hung out. I was still reading, obviously, a lot. I was doing some writing during that time, some drawing, not really any painting, and kind of bounced around a fair amount. And then it was a couple of years really before I kind of got back committed. I took some classes at a community college actually, and ended up taking some art classes there. And I had some encouragement from an art teacher, so that in my early 20s, when I kind of got back sort of seriously pursuing a degree again, I just kind of naturally gravitated in that direction. And the school that I ended up at had just a really terrific art department. It was UNC Asheville in North Carolina. And so, yeah, it was just a really great place to be and make art. So it kind of drew me in that direction.
You mentioned that you were drawn to drawing and painting, also to reading and writing and theater. Is in the art community and in when you're focusing on art in school, is there the pressure to kind of choose a discipline and focus on that, or is it encouraged to kind of try your hand at numerous things?
There's definitely some pressure to focus, and I think, obviously there's a certain amount of trying your hand, to an extent, like very early on, but it doesn't take long really before, just in essence, that could just be the nature of the university system, right? It's like these teachers have their departments. They want to build their departments with talented students or students that they think they can groom or that they like, or the kind of usual, social interaction stuff that happens in universities. So yeah, there's a fair amount of like, oh, you're good at painting, so come take my painting class, and that kind of thing. And so, and not that they would discourage you if you wanted to double major. I knew some double majors in the art department, but certainly, just majoring in art alone was plenty challenging. So, yeah.
I'm always really fascinated in the intersection of art disciplines or even things that are not considered traditional art disciplines, and the art that we make, the intersection of those things and the thing we wind up doing, and how they tend to influence each other. Do you see your love and practice of visual art? Do you see that shows up in your writing? Or do you think that pursuing that thing gave you a particular skill that you use as a writer? Yes to the latter question. Yes, I think that what I learned from sort of trying to make it as an artist, so to speak, was a disciplined practice, and just kind of learning to build that into my life. So what I mean by that is, most of us kind of working in those creative fields, whatever it is, we're usually holding down a day job, at the same time. And we're usually also, trying to pursue, relationships or marriage, friendships, social life, maybe even some other hobbies. And so because I had gone to art school, and in art school in the beginning, you're spending just enormous amounts of time in your studio making your art, but you're also still having to take gen ed classes. You still have to pass algebra, Right.
So from the get-go, you're kind of learning how to balance that. And then, for me, I just kind of took that into the world. And I also worked through college, so that helped too. I worked in the restaurant industry and sort of put myself through college. And so for me, it was just always a normal thing to be like, oh, I got to work today. And then either before work or after work, I've got 3 hours that I can work on my own stuff, 4 hours work on my own stuff. So that when it came time that I wanted to write a book, it was I didn't have to rearrange the structure of my life at all. I just kind of had to take that time, and literally it's in the same room that I was making art in, but just going into that same room the same time I always was, only now instead of, picking up a paintbrush, I was just sitting, opening up the laptop. So.
Well, let's talk about your visual art for a minute. What was it that drove you in that direction, and how does a visual artist make a living at that these days? What is how do you pursue that as something that is a career?
There's the boom and bust approach of just trying to make it as a fine artist, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because at the upper end, if you sort of crack the gallery scene in a big city, New York, LA, in a handful of other cities, you're sort of it's a kind of superstardom. You're going to make a fair amount of money. You're going to be comfortable, and you're certainly going to be well known in certain circles, and all of that, would happen. But of course, that's like a fraction of the 1% of people that are trying to do it that sort of make it to that level. And there's not a lot of middle ground, but there is a middle ground, and the middle ground tends to be people that are, showing either in smaller galleries or in artist-run spaces. They're probably selling some work. They're probably selling work at art fairs. They're probably still also holding down some other sort of supplementary job. There are a few characters in my book that are in that exact situation where they have a career. They actually have an art career. They have people that buy their work and that know their work, but they're not like entirely financially able to sustain themselves on that career. And so I think that's probably it,
Gotcha. You mentioned that you went to college in North Carolina. There's a hint of North Carolina left in your voice. What enamored you of New York, and how did you wind up there?
Well, I should say first that my wife is from North Carolina, and she's from sort of the area that Reddick, the protagonist in the book, is from. So I met her in North Carolina, and so we just kind of have made this sort of journey north together,
Yeah.
A couple of expatriated Southerners here. But we initially sort of what pulled us up here at first was I got into grad school in Philadelphia. So I went to grad school in Philadelphia, and then because we were settled there, she did the same. We sort of took turns going to graduate school, and then once we were both done with that, sort of took another year or two to sort of gather ourselves. And then at that point, while we were in Philadelphia, a lot of our friends had moved to New York, either as artists or otherwise, and there's a kind of a gravity that the city has, and Philadelphia is close enough to kind of be in that gravity, So it just seemed like the right thing to do. It's like, and I knew at that point that I didn't want to sort of go be an art professor somewhere, which would require sort of, heading to some small school, like kind of out in the country and kind of working your way up through the ranks. I just kind of wanted to move to a big city and just see what happened.
And what did happen when you got there? How did you kind of get into the art scene and get settled?
Well, I worked, mostly freelance, art handling, essentially. I had some friends that were sort of already here, but, no one that was sort of established or anything even close to it, and my wife is a librarian. That's what she went to school for. She was able to find sort of really good work kind of immediately, and then I was just sort of bouncing around taking whatever I could find, essentially, because it was not that easy to find. And then I kind of kept making work and kind of kept trying to show work and did a little bit of showed a little bit here and there, but I just was finding, the longer that I was here, the kind of less passionate I felt about sort of pursuing that. And then I ended up kind of working in a commercial art area, doing printmaking. And when I was doing that, in a way, it sort of scratched that itch to like make visual stuff, even though it was like commercial, I'm still working with color and, having to make visual decisions and that kind of stuff. And it, in a way, it sort of felt freed up a little bit. I was like, well, I'd been playing with writing off and on, since grad school. And I was like, well, let me just try to write a book, let me just try to actually do this, not getting any younger. It's time to do it.
I think that contrast, that conflict maybe between commerce and art is something that we've talked about for centuries, probably longer than that. That there's always this thing about I want to make the kind of art I want to make, but then I also want to pay rent and buy groceries. Is that something that ever that an artist ever makes peace with? I know writers deal with the same thing. Should I write to to this genre? Do I need to make sure I include certain tropes? But that's not the story I want to tell. But I also want to be able to sell the book. That's something that we all deal with. But how do you kind of try to find peace with balancing what your loves and passions are and finding an audience? If I knew, I would tell you. I think it's a sort of thing that everyone figures out how to navigate that, or maybe negotiate that on their own, and it probably shapes up differently for everyone. Yeah,
and across different fields too. Because there's not really a corollary for like writing genre fiction, if with art, you know what I mean? I guess maybe there are, but there's not. I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like when you're making a painting that you can say like, oh, if I bend it in this direction, it's necessarily more likely to sell. I mean, I don't know. I guess you could. Let me roll that back a little bit and say, I guess you could look at the sort of macro trends in the art world and try to sort of, copy those or imitate those. But yeah, it kind of ends up working out sort of slightly differently. And for writing, for me, I think because at that point I had a job that was self-sustained, and I was just like wanted to write the book that I wanted to write. And if it completely fell through, it was like, well, I was financially afloat, I wasn't drowning. So, yeah.
So your new book, Restoration Heights, as I'm kind of feeling my way around your story of where you got to here, I'm picking up a lot of, at least initially, some similarities between you and Reddick, the kind of protagonist of the book, as it begins. And he's a young white artist, lives in Bed-Stuy, and he starts to really pay attention to the way the community is changing and the gentrification that seems to be prevalent in a lot of these older neighborhoods. What was the impetus that got this story going for you?
It was kind of that. I mean, there were really a couple of things. I should say first that I had been working on it. When I said that I was going to stop painting and write a novel, that novel wasn't Restoration Heights. That was another novel that I finished but never made it out of the studio. But so I had been working on that. And so a lot of the thoughts of a lot of the ideas that would become Restoration Heights were kind of percolating for a little while, and I've lived in the same apartment in Brooklyn for, since 2010. And I go to the Bed-Stuy Y, which is in the book, Bed-Stuy YMCA, I should say. And so just kind of being in this community, meeting people, knowing people, but being relatively new to it myself, at that time, I've only been here, 4 or 5 years. And so I would see things shift, and it's a sort of familiar pattern that it's kind of been paying attention to what's been happening in big cities in America for the past 15 years at least, where you have neighborhoods, sort of working class neighborhoods, generally people of color, they're sort of being displaced as they become sort of trendy art neighborhoods, sort of the artists move in first, creative types move in first, and the businesses follow. And that had already happened to plenty of other neighborhoods in Brooklyn, but was only really starting to happen to my neighborhood when I moved here. And so I kind of saw a lot of those changes, and, I would resent them. I would be like, oh, I used to love this, this little breakfast spot that I used to go to, and it served everyone in the community, and like everyone could go there. And now it's like a vegan bakery, and it's just full of like 20 something white kids, and but then of course there's that moment of like self-awareness where it's like, well, I am part of the reason that they're here,
Right.
Being like, that time in my 30s, but being like a 30 something white artist, it's like, yeah, I helped cause this, and so it's weird to know that that you helped cause a process that you resent, and how to actually sort of deal with that. And I was fortunate enough, because I was sort of a regular at the Bed-Stuy, to know some people that had been in the neighborhood for a few generations, older, younger, and to have like, honestly, fairly frank conversations about things that were happening in the neighborhood. And so hearing some different perspectives and, sort of being able to combine that with sort of what I was feeling. And I just kind of, at that point, was like, I should write about this. This should really be in whatever my next book is, because it was a sort of a meaningful experience that I was just living on a day-to-day basis.
Right. It's kind of a strange feeling when you start seeing things change around you. It happens, in lots, not just in metropolis New York, but we see our smaller towns where demographics start changing, and you're like, well, I wonder why this certain group of people have all moved out somewhere else, and this other group of people have taken their place, and you start realizing that it's because we allow things like that to happen, and a lot of times we are the problem. Mm-hmm. When you start realizing that, and it's easy to say those people messed up. Mm-hmm. And it's another thing to say, oh, I was part of those people. How, when you start kind of reckoning with that, how do you begin to affect some sort of change to stop the sea change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that question was in some ways that was what sort of drove me to write the book. It was like, because in the book there's a sort of protests that are happening about that one particular development that sort of symbolizes to Reddick all the changes that are happening. And so he's sort of going to the rallies for that, but he's just not sort of an activist type person, per se. So he's going to it because he feels like he should, and he does feel like driven to do that because he does care, but it's not necessarily the avenue that he's 100% committed to that's the right solution. And then he's also kind of a lazy guy, so a lot of it he's like, well, as long as I just go hang out and play basketball with my friends and just, I'm fine, like I'm absolved because I'm a man of the people here, so, and to some extent, some of that is true, where it's like, and hopefully that comes across in the book, where, the key to, if you're moving into a new community, is like involve yourself in the activities that are already there in that community, become a part of it, and usually whatever community that is, Black, Hispanic, white, wherever you move, if you go there with a sort of a genuine desire to say like, hey, I don't want to change things. I moved here and I just want to be a part, people will welcome you with open arms in my experience. So there's some truth to that, but obviously there's a limit to how much that can do in terms of preventing changes from happening.
Sure. And before anyone misunderstands the complete point of the book, this is not just a story of gentrification and how neighborhoods change and what the social fallout of that is. That this book is so much more than that. That's just the initial kind of impetus to get the story going. But this also, I can see the early Encyclopedia Brown influence in the book. That's why I love to hear what people's initial, kind of fascinations are, because those things always pop back up in our writing. And this really turns into a mystery, and, a set against this really, fascinating backdrop of the other things going on there. Tell us about Hannah and how the story makes this turn.
This was one of those sort of, I think you probably know this as a writer. It's like sometimes things just happen, and when they happen, you don't know why yet, but you're like, I'm saving that. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to jot down notes of whatever that experience was, because that is something. I just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
So for me, there's a scene very early. It's more or less the opening scene of the book where Reddick runs into Hannah in this alleyway and next to his building, and she's really drunk, and she makes this really clumsy pass, and he's kind of wondering if he should do something, that she seems so drunk that maybe it's not safe for her to be just out and about, and then she just, before he can really do anything at all, she sort of disappears with someone. That happened more or less exactly like that to me. And when it happened, first I came back up, and my wife was upstairs. I had just gone down to take the garbage out, and I laughed, and I was like, you'll never believe what just happened to me in this, alleyway. Hilarious. But then, like, that same night before I even went to bed, I was like, that's kind of a hook,
Right.
So I just wrote it down, like, in the first person, like 2 pages description of it, just to keep the details, hold on to the details. And then it was, some months later before I went back to it, and was like, well, what if that ends up being the last time that this girl is seen, and then from there, the story just kind of built from there. It's like, who is she? How would, what about it would get Reddick, involved enough that he would start looking for her? Why is she missing? Is she really missing? Is she dead? If she's dead, why is she dead? And, filling in the answer to those questions. And really kind of early on, I kind of came up with the sort of central twist / con of the book, which obviously won't spill here. And once I had that, then everything else kind of filled in very quickly.
In writing this, and like you said, I know exactly what you mean about sometimes the story becomes its own thing and takes on a life of its own and becomes bigger than the thing initially in your head. When you begin a story like this, do you plan out what you see the book becoming? Are you discovering it as you write it? What's your process for tracking where the story's going and kind of what your daily writing is going to be?
I, maybe unsurprisingly, sort of worked somewhat visually. I grabbed a piece of foam core and wrote down sort of major plot points on Post-it notes, at plot points / clues. I don't really think of them so much as clues, because it's not a mystery and sort of who done it. Let me piece together these clues and solve it. It's more of a kind of a procedural, like, certain things will be revealed at certain times, and I wanted to pace those out in a way that was compelling for the reader. So I did a lot of that kind of writing when Reddick would find out certain things, and kind of wrote that all on a Post-it note or Post-it notes, and kind of wrote the days of the week at the top of the board, and then just kind of moved those around until I had like an investigation that I thought kind of worked, and then sort of did a written outline off of that, and then, again, kind of further revised from that. this is all before sort of starting the draft at all. And then of course, once I started the draft, continued to tinker with that outline. I didn't let myself be totally held in place by it. And there were definitely some significant changes that happened in terms of, the sequence of events. As I was writing. So I guess I would say that I started with a firm enough structure to give me something that I could just look at and be like, oh, today Reddick needs to find out X, Y, and Z, and then from there, if I felt like things needed to move around, I just went by instinct at that point.
I love that you approach the story visually, as you should. But I do a little bit of that as well. Sometimes I'll have a story idea and I'll go into Photoshop, and I'm a complete hack, but, I'll go in and just start playing with some visual ideas of kind of how some things might, visually represent things in my mind. And a lot of times that unlocks new potential and new, ideas. And, it's just all for my benefit, just playing with things,
I was just to say on that it reminds me, I don't remember how long ago it was. I was pretty young and I saw a photo of William Faulkner of his writing studio.
Yes.
Have you seen this? The wall in front of him is just covered with pages, and they're all moved around, they're all pasted up, and it kind of looks like a madman works there. But it was just kind of an amazing thing to see that all laid out, and I just thought like, oh, that's how you write a book.
Right. I live just down the highway from Faulkner's home, and it's insane. But a beautiful insanity. The kind that folks like me and you just geek out about, and other people say, this guy, there's bodies buried somewhere, you see. But, I talked with fantasy author, Christopher Paolini, a few days ago, and we were talking about, he was talking about structuring, Microsoft Word, so that what he sees on the screen is going to be very similar to the printed page. And he said that was really important to him because he wanted to look at the prose and get a visual sense of how paragraphs are structured, how dialogue breaks are, and he said that the visual, the seeing of how the page would be printed, and being able to see how conversations appear, that is very important to him, and it gives him a deeper sense of how the story looks on a different level. Do you ever think about things like that and look at the prose and see, well, these are big paragraphs. That's probably, maybe too much exposition. Maybe I need to break that up here. Does that visual aspect ever come into play for you?
Yeah, surprisingly not that much. It does a little bit, but I tend to do more of the sort of listening, which I know a lot of writers do too, sort of reading it out loud. And yeah, I probably tend to do more, like, strangely enough, I know, given my background and the fact that I couldn't carry a tune with a bucket, but I tend to listen to my writing more than I tend to look at my writing.
Yeah. Well, for folks with a theater background, I know several authors and I've done some community theater and stuff, but there's something about reading back your prose, especially in the dialogue and kind of giving voice to characters, giving character to characters, it will really unlock some things that just reading it to yourself never will. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same.
Do you have a daily writing habit, when you're working on a project? Do you give yourself certain requirements that you need to meet, or, do you just kind of come and go with it as particular inspiration hits?
Especially when writing a first draft, which, obviously I'm kind of doing now for another novel. So I'm kind of back into, I set sort of word count goals for the week. And so for a given day, if I'm like behind or ahead, and they're not overly ambitious, I think. I mean, they're realistic word count goals based on, on what I've found, the kind of pace that I'm currently having. If I think I should, can increase that pace or decrease it. But I find that doing that for the first draft, and I only do that for the first draft, keeps me from getting bogged down. But because I could definitely, I'm sure everyone's, maybe does this to some extent, but I don't want to go back and get stuck making a particular section really work if, 30,000 words from now, I'm just going to cut that section entirely, before it even makes it out of my studio, so I hit that first draft running. And then, and like I said, set sort of weekly word count goals. And I have a very structured life, for better or for worse, that I have there's certain times of each day that I have allotted to write, and that's the time that I have. And, so I have to work during that time, whether I like it or not. And with that being said, obviously everyone has bad days. And so learning how to write out those bad days where I'm like, oh crap, I only wrote like 500 words on Tuesday. I was just sitting there for like 3 hours. How did I only get 500 words written? But that'll throw you off your goal. But then if that happens, and then the next week I'm like, all right, I'm going to get like 5,000 words this week. And then I'm like, oh, I wrote 3,000 words today. I'm like ahead, Right. So I kind of pay attention to use that as a goal to keep me moving quickly. But yeah, again, I don't get too hung up on it.
Yeah, it's the pressure can be crippling. A lot of people, I'll hear authors say, well, I set 2,000 words a day. And that is fantastic if you can do that, but it only takes 1 or 2 missed days, or, you're sick, or you have to go to a doctor's appointment or something, and that schedule gets crushed. And then the next day you're dealing with the guilt of what you didn't do the day before. And, it can really, do a number on you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So finding manageable things that are realistic is super important. The new book, Restoration Heights, is fantastic, Wil. I love this book. I love what you're doing. What do you hope people take away from this book? It's a great story. It's a fantastic read. It's very entertaining. But it also deals with some heavy stuff. But it's not just about the heavy stuff. What do you hope people's experience with this book is?
Yeah, I would hope that people find it to be both a compelling read that keeps them sort of, glued to the page, I guess, is that after it's done, that there are some things to think about. There are issues in the book that are very intentionally left ambiguous, not in terms of plot, but in terms of the themes, that are intentionally ambiguous. And they're ambiguous because they're not easy questions, and they're questions that are worth thinking about. So that's what I hope people do then, I guess, is continue to think about those issues.
Well, the book is out everywhere now in hardcover, in ebook, on the Kindle store, also an audiobook from audible.com. Wil, I love what you're doing. If people want to know more about you and kind of follow along with what's going on in your life and work, is there a place where they can connect with you?
Yeah, you could find me on Twitter. My handle is Brooklyn Finn. I'm not even going to bother to explain how that's about, but it's Brooklyn Finn. It involves football. But I do, tweet about my work and sort of what's happening, as well as complaining about sports teams.
As you should.
Yeah, exactly. And then, they could also find me on Instagram, WILMDRS. And of course, if you just Google my name, both of those will show up if you don't remember the handles. So.
Excellent. Well, we'll put links to them in the show notes, as well as a link where you, the listeners, can buy your copy of Restoration Heights. Wil, it's been great to talk with you today. I wish you much success on the book.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
He led Jason to a small bistro. The door set tiny bells to chime as they entered. The place shivered with smells. Coffee, hot chocolate, and croissants. "This," he said, extending his arm towards a woman in an apron, "is Jennifer. She makes the best scones and is tragically spoken for." He kissed the woman's hand. She was plump, in her 50s. She had left one curler to dangle at the back of her head this morning. "If it's a tragedy to you, this is the first I've heard of it." She swatted at him with a menu. "Why didn't you speak up 20 years ago, lady killer?" Jason sat. Jennifer put a glass of water in front of him. "And who is this fine gentleman?"
"This," said Hedwig, joining, "is my son's great-grandfather's great-great-nephew."
"That's a lot of greats. Any great-great-great-whatever of Hedwig is great by me." She giggled at her own wit. "I'll be back for your orders." Hedwig swatted her rear end with a menu as she left. He made small talk about the bistro, the specials, what was good, the Benedict, or not so, the hanger steak. When their orders came, coffee for both, eggs for Jason, a scone for himself, he got down to business.
"I met your grandmother about, a year ago. Valerie and I have a mutual interest in old families, particularly old families related to the legend for obvious reasons. Valerie's lived in Tarrytown for years, though her family's up near Boston. Now, don't worry. I don't believe all that nonsense about a headless horseman. Valerie's the superstitious one. But the Van Brunts are definitely the family in Irving's story. Hermanus Van Brunt and his wife Agatha were farmers in the village back in 1780 or so. This was during the Revolution. Hermanus grabbed title to lands left by a Tory family who'd been tarred and feathered and shipped back to Britain. Do you know your history?" "Sure. Tory. Loyal to the king. Benjamin Franklin broke with his own son who was a Tory." "Smart boy." "Traitors to the cause. And that was serious business. The British marched straight through here during the war, chased George Washington off Manhattan and out to New Jersey. And after they were kicked out again, a lot of Tories were kicked out with them. Anyway, the Van Brunts took over some farmland north of Tarrytown. They had a son, Abraham. And, of course, their son Abraham married a wealthy heiress.
Katrina Van Tassel."
"Yes. All that is true. It's public record, just like the legend says. My mother left behind quite a few documents written by Abraham Van Brunt, Brom, in Dutch mostly. He was powerful around here. With Katrina's money, he became the biggest stone merchant in the state. He died in 1850. After him, it's Dillon Van Brunt, his son Joseph, the grandson, then Cornelius, then—"
"Sorry, genealogy is not my thing."
"No?"
"Why was Eliza doing research on the Van Brunts?"
"She wasn't. She was looking into the Cranes. That's what made us such fast friends."
"I don't get it."
"We do go back a ways, your family and mine."
"More coffee?" Jennifer appeared at Jason's elbow. Hedwig nodded, and she poured. "Still not getting it," said Jason. But he did. Hedwig turned to the waitress, and Jason knew what he would say.
"My lady, may I present—"
He raised his coffee cup, proclaiming,
"the last descendant of Ichabod Crane."